Hello, my name is Donna Spencer and I'm a website and application designer. Today we're going to learn about sitemaps and information architecture, which are often the first things you'll design in a project. A sitemap is a diagram that shows how the pages in your website or app are arranged, what they're called, and how they relate to each other. A sitemap isn't meant to be a complex diagram and doesn't need to communicate a lot of detail about every page. The sitemap should be a relatively simple drawing showing the structure of the website or app overall. I almost always have a spreadsheet that also lists out all the pages with a lot of extra detail such as notes, what a page is going to contain, what content it has, and a lot more. The sitemap doesn't need to do all of that. Before you start drawing a sitemap, you need to know what content you're working with, or what your pages and sections will be, how you're organising and structuring the content itself. This, of course, is the actual hard part. Drawing the sitemap at the end is the easy part. So in this video, I'm going to give you some tips about broad and deep hierarchies, classification schemes, and how to actually come up with your information architecture. A broad hierarchy is one where there are a lot of pages at the top level, but it might not go down many levels. This example has 6 items at the top level, which actually isn't very many, but my example website isn't huge. It goes down to 3 levels in most places and 4 levels in one place. A deep hierarchy is one where there are a few pages at the top level, but it will go down many levels. In this example, we have 4 items at the top level. It goes down 4 levels in most places and 5 levels in one place. There's actually no right or wrong way to arrange content, whether a sitemap is broad or deep, but each type does have advantages and disadvantages, and that's what you need to think about for your project. A broad hierarchy is often good because by having more items at the top level, these items can be more specific and concrete. Let me explain that a bit more. It's easy for us to understand things that are concrete, specific, and can be visualised. So if you're working, for example, with a clothing store, not my cake example, it's going to be easier for people to understand things like shirts, jeans, and scarves. You can get those in your head, you can visualise them, than things like tops, bottoms, and accessories, which are much harder to get a picture in your mind about. The thing is, when you have to group items together, you always end up making a category that's slightly more abstract than the items themselves. A broad hierarchy is good for sites and applications where people will need to start at the homepage and navigate from there. Because it's shallow, it doesn't take many steps to go from home to where you need to go. Of course, the disadvantage of a broad hierarchy is that there's a long list of categories to read. But truly, it's easier to skim a long list of concrete categories than a short list of fairly abstract ones. The other disadvantage of a broad hierarchy is it can be harder to design navigation for. This is especially so for small screen devices. The advantage of a deep hierarchy is that it's easier to design navigation for, again, particularly for small screen devices. On-screen navigation bars can only take a small number of items. So if you're working on a website or application that web search can access, or you have good on-site search, a deep hierarchy can be okay, as people can start deep in the hierarchy via search. In this case, the hierarchy itself matters little, as people don't have to navigate from a homepage down into it. But if people do have to start from a homepage, like an intranet, a deep hierarchy can mean a lot of steps and page loads, which might be problematic. But the biggest disadvantage of deep hierarchies is that the section labels will often become quite abstract. When you have to group any ideas together, you end up making the category more abstract than the items that it contains. The most important thing to know here is that there's no right or wrong. Think about the type of website or application that you're working with and make it work for you. And design the sitemap before you design navigation, so you aren't caught trying to adapt your sitemap to navigation that doesn't fit. One of the most difficult decisions in coming up with an information architecture, and one that teams will discuss endlessly, is what classification scheme to use for your content. And by classification scheme, I mean, are you going to arrange your content by audience, task, topic, or something else? Again, there's no right and wrong answers to this, but there are definitely places where each of these work well and less well. So that's what we'll talk about here. I'll start with the one that we use most often. I call this a topic-based scheme. And what I mean by that is it's a scheme that isn't particularly anything else. It's just topics, subjects, ideas, a loose collection of categories that works well for your content and your users. You'll see when I talk about other classification schemes how this is the kind of odd one out. So in my example, I started off with recipes, premixes, accessories, and how to bake. That's not any particular kind of scheme, but it brings the content together into groups that I think will work. You'll always have to come up with your own topic scheme for your content. You can't use an existing classification scheme, that exists in the world. The main advantage of this kind of scheme, and the main reason that we use it all the time, is it's super flexible, easy to customise to your content, and easy to change over time. So now we have that bits and pieces example out of the way, let's look at some more detailed defined schemes. We'll start with an audience scheme, as this is the one I hear most often from teams. At some point on every project, somebody always says, we should arrange this content for particular audiences. It usually happens as a result of some persona work, so understanding users and what personas they are, or often happens when there are people in the organisation responsible for delivering to particular audiences. The main problem with an audience-based scheme is that people don't think about themselves as an audience group. I don't go around thinking about myself as a business customer or a personal customer of a service. And often people fall into more than one audience group. And that can mean that they'll either miss out on something you include for one audience or feel the need to check in more than one place if they can't figure out which one they most belong to. The second problem is that the content doesn't usually fit neatly into audience groups either. You'll almost always have content that is for more than one audience. And then how do you deal with that? Do you duplicate it, or do you make an area that's for everyone, or do you link to it? And the moment you start asking yourselves these questions, that's the moment you'll realise that this isn't the right scheme for you. It can work sometimes. It can work when people clearly associate with a particular group and where the content clearly and neatly splits into those audience groups. Another kind of scheme that often looks like it will work and will often come up early in a project is a task-based scheme. You can imagine something like a travel site where you might book, fly, and arrive. Or you might have other verbs like apply, send, and receive. The main problem with a task-based scheme is that there's usually a lot of things that people need to do that don't fall into these nice verbs. A lot of activity on the internet is read, research, learn, or waste time. Maybe if we called it waste time, we'd do a lot less of it. This scheme only really works if you have a very concise service where people do a few things. If that's you, it's a great approach. I've just actually never come across something so concise that can fall into a task-based scheme. I thought I should at least try for my cake example. I could think of some good verbs, but I couldn't think of what content could go where. So it certainly wasn't a good scheme for this example. A geography-based scheme is good for two kinds of things. Things in the physical world and things from the physical world. If your content can be tidily arranged for geography, this might be a really good approach for you. Be mindful of whether people understand the geography though. It makes sense to organise tourist content by geography as landmarks are in physical places. But if people haven't visited before and don't understand the geography, they may not be able to understand what they're looking for. I've been tripped up a lot when researching travel by sites that assume I already know the geography, and I don't yet, so I can't kind of find what I'm looking for yet until I understand the geography. If that's the case for you, make sure you give people other ways to find the content as well. Another way you could arrange content is by its format or genre. I did this a little in my example here, as recipes and how to bake are both formats, but I didn't attempt to do the whole website according to format. If you're thinking about this, make sure the formats make sense to people and are how they would like to access the content. I see a lot of FAQ and video sections on the internet that really aren't a useful starting point when you, for example, want to find out how to bake a pastry case or find a great chocolate cake. Video and FAQ will not do that for you. The last classification scheme I want to mention is anything that follows some kind of timeline. I've seen real examples that go something like school, college, getting married, buying a house, having children, etc., until death. And it kind of makes sense. There is often different information you might want to give people at these stages of life, particularly for things like finances and education. The problem with anything linear like this is that you're inferring that there's a correct way to do things and that this sequence is the correct way, where really people do things in their own sequence and they can feel very excluded if they feel like you're forcing them into yours. A life stage or a timeline sequence can be used and it can be a good way of arranging content, but really think about whether your information needs to be strictly in that sequence and whether people will think about it in that way. You don't have to pick just one of these and use it throughout. You can use bits and pieces of each classification scheme. For example, in my cake website, I have recipes, which are a format, cakes by flavour, which is kind of topic, and some cakes for kids, as that seemed to be a distinct cake audience. But I didn't attempt to do the whole thing by audience. I have some products by topics and some how to bake, which is kind of format, with the articles in there arranged by topic. Okay, so I've told you about broad and deep hierarchies and a bit about different kinds of classification schemes. The last part I want to cover in this little video is how to come up with the information architecture and sitemap itself. The other things you need to know are what content you'll have to work with and a pretty good understanding of the things that your users need to do. Then what you need to do is just explore different ways of organising the content. See what things go together and try different ways of arranging it. See what happens when you try to make a hierarchy deeper or shallower. See what happens if you use different kinds of organisation schemes. You'll find some things just don't work. For example, when I was making this video, I tried to make the audience scheme, I tried to make the task-based scheme, but I just couldn't make them work with the content. They're just not for this content, and that's great to find out. At least when somebody says, why don't we arrange this by audience, I've tried it and I know that it won't work. When you've come up with some things that you think will work, think through some user tasks and think about whether this way of organising content will help people find what they need. This really is a quite exploratory process, so give yourself some time to do it and definitely try out more than one approach. And of course, try making little prototypes of the content and test them out with your users. That's always the best way to see if the ideas will work.